Very pleased to be here in Métis Region 5, part of Nipissing District, and of course the city of North Bay. At this point, we're going to shift gears just slightly from the State of the North theme, and I'm going to ask Mayor Peter Politis to come up and talk about an event that was hosted in Cochrane a couple weeks ago, and I think copies of what resulted from that are all at your seats, but I'll leave the discussion to Peter himself, and then I'll come back for concluding remarks about the conference. So over to you.
Coming near the end of the day, trust me, I know I'm between you and heading home, so we'll make this as quick as possible, but I think we have a really important topic to cover that I think will, as I was listening to the discussions go on here today, will really tie in a lot of the different discussions that have been taking place. And really what we've done here is it's about a 3-year process. So I'm going to give you some background on how this really interesting evolutionary both approach and result in what we have as an accord that is now being circulated to be signed by the local regional representation. You have a copy of that accord on your tables, but I'm going to give you some background on how this sort of unfolded, and then we'll talk about the approach itself and how unique it is and how we think it's evolutionary and how it's something that we as Northerners really need to start considering in terms of moving forward and driving a lot of the really interesting things that we're hearing at the summit here. And then we have the accord, and we'll go through the points on the accord really quickly to talk about how important they are, and then we'll have a quick conversation on, what is the next move here? How do we continue driving this across the board, and how we continue, as I would say, the movement itself. And I still think I'm young, but I'm not, so I'm going to try to put these on and see this. I'm going to go without it. So starting off, we're just clicking here the button. Perfect. Okay, so this is 3 years in the making, this process, and it started out with a lot of discussions around frustrations that Northerners were having and coming to regional meetings like the Northeastern Ontario Municipal Association and meeting with folks and talking to the Phenom folks and the Northwestern Ontario Municipal Association and having all the same common challenges, which is, we're really not getting a lot of traction on the things that we need in Northern Ontario. We're really not driving what we really need to get done here. We really don't have a long-term vision or plan. And that's not to say that the regulators or the government themselves don't have some type of vision or plan, but politically speaking, there really was no clear evidence of where is this plan. We seem to be all over the place. And you heard the previous Northern Growth Plan kicked around quite a bit, which I think was a novel idea, but when you look at it from a technical standpoint, it really is a terms of reference for a plan. It came out in 2008 and really never got to first base, and we're here in 2018 right now. So the challenge was, we've got to get past political speaking, we've got to get past high-level commitments in motherhood, and we have to get into action to drive where we are and what we want to do in our region. The next element that came to bear for us in terms of the background, what we really needed to do, was drive the need for a comprehensive long-term business plan. And so when you look at how governments are running the province, and a lot of the speakers have spoke about some of these things, we're really thinking in Northern Ontario, at least, in 4-year cycles. We're not thinking in long-term cycles. The challenge with that, obviously, is we have a very vast and large region. 90% of the provincial landmass is in Northern Ontario, about 6% of the population. So we have a very large rural dynamic. Of the 300 communities in Northern Ontario, this large, massive piece of geography, if you include 106 Indigenous communities, there are 300 communities, 92% of them are 3,000 people or less. 97% of them are 1,000 people or less. You have a hugely rural dynamic in region, very complicated. Any type of investment is not a small little investment that will grow into something big. Everything you do in this region to move this region forward is a massive investment. And it's prohibitive in the type of environment that we live in. So when you look at some of the more populously dense areas like the US and like Europe, for example, there's a lot that can be done because their population density is a lot higher. They have a lot more money per capita to move in that square kilometer of geography, if you will. So that was a challenge here for us, for sure, in Northern Ontario in terms of driving a lot of the planning forward. So the challenge for us was, where's the long-term comprehensive business plan that speaks to, if we do this, this, and this, if we invest here, here, and here, this is how we become a bigger part of a better Ontario. And where is that dialogue and that dialect? So when you talk about Southern Ontario, for example, is a perfect example. When the area was first settled, there was obviously a need for infrastructure. There was a need for roads, there was a need for rail, there was a need for infrastructure. A plan was put into place, and it transcended governments. So each government, regardless of who you were, would take a piece and build their piece of that. We really need to start thinking in those terms in Northern Ontario as well. And if we had been, for example, if you look at the folks to the east of us, and even the folks to the west of Manitoba, and the folks east of us with the Plan Zanal in Quebec, they're making the investments. They made the investments, and they have an economy that's being driven because they made those investments. When you look at the Ring of Fire, and this is only one element, if you're talking about the Northern Ontario becoming reaching its full potential, then the Ring of Fire really is only one element, as amazing as that sounds. But if we had been making the investments in infrastructure and transmission for power and everything that was needed to drive the Ring of Fire, it would be running today as we speak. So that's the expense of not making the investments. When you don't make the investments, you have one of the biggest economic fines in the province sitting stagnant, waiting for somebody to figure out what to do with it. And then when we looked at the process, we were talking about, format. How do we change format? When you look at how rural Northern Ontario is, it's very important, obviously, to have a grassroots approach to how you're going to drive things. Because if you're just going to go to the 5 major centers in Northern Ontario, who are extremely important to the development of the region, obviously. But if you're just going to go to those areas, you're missing out on that whole other dynamic I was talking about. About half of the population exists in those 5 major centers. The other half exists in the 295 communities we spoke about, which are 3,000 to 1,000 people or less. So you can never reach your full potential until you understand that dynamic and you start building around that dynamic. And part of that dynamic is recognizing that Northerners are a rural, grassroots-orientated people, even in the larger centers, for the most part. And our formats on how we're going to discuss and dialogue and drive a lot of these initiatives need to have a grassroots approach to them for them to have a buy-in associated to it, so people feel that, that's something that we do. So we're looking at the comprehensive plan that was needed and the change the format so that we can have some buy-in in how we're doing things. Now, when you look at the approach, we've changed it, or we tried to change it, and I think it was very successful in how it worked out, from a pontification-style conference where you stand up front, you pontificate for 45 minutes, you have a 5-minute Q&A, and everybody moves on to the next topic, to a real grassroots think tank summit-style approach. So what you're looking at now are folks who are involved in a think tank, exchanging ideas back and forth. We didn't even create the agenda. We had the audience create their agenda. We didn't want to tell them, this is what you need to talk about. The whole point of a grassroots approach is having folks come in and say, this is what the issues are, let's start diving into them. We hired very high-end facilitators. We brought them in to make sure that you know how we are. It's not that we always get along, we don't get along, but we have challenges when we get passionate and we start talking about certain issues. And we have a very diverse culture in Northern Ontario. From the Anglophone culture to the francophone culture to the Indigenous culture, it's extremely diverse with a lot of different, goals and objectives of folks. So you have to be able to have a format and have a facilitated discussion to allow you to have the type of conversation that will let you get to the points you need to get to without getting lost in the mix of things. So folks came in, they identified the ideas in a think tank. We came out of the think tank, we brought all the groups together in a think tank at large, we cross-pollinated, and then the committee took the ideas and built the next topics for the next think tank. And the whole day went like that, the next day went like that, and the first half of the next day after that went like that. So it continued to build momentum and grab traction on the ideas that were important to the group that were sitting in the room. So part of the format change was, who do we invite? Who do we bring? And when you think of economic development in our region, there are 3 key pillars that are involved. First, there are the political leaders, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And we have to start having the discussion, as the folks we're talking about here today, with respect to, and I loved the conversation around institutions and who are we, and where are we trying to go, and how do we evolve to where we're going. It's 2018, and we're still conducting ourselves like early colonialists, where we really have to start looking at what is the makeup of Northern Ontario, who is the Northern family. And how do we strengthen that family? How do we come together as a family and continue moving forward? So it was important for us to make sure Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks sat at the same table, eye to eye, speaking about the region as the Northern family. And so that was an important move for us to do. The next one was to make sure that we had regulators, the government regulators, sitting in that discussion as well too, because now you have the political folks, but you also have to have the government regulators who have to implement a lot of these great ideas that us ideas folks come up with. And we invited top-end regulators from right across the government spectrum to come and participate in the project as well. And then also, obviously, you need practitioners, which are the economic development practitioners. So if you have the three pillars there together talking about ideas in a think tank format, then I think that it's key to try to expect, at least at the end of the day, that you're going to have this grassroots, high-level, driven, energized, traction-orientated discussion of the points that are important to people. And there's one more key element that we thought would be important to try to accomplish, and that was to come up with an accord or a statement of purpose or some type of high-level political agreement, bringing the political leaders together, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and talking about what's important to us, putting that on a piece of paper, and making sure we have that laid out for the government at the hand to say, you know what, we've come together as Northerners, these are the expectations we have, this is what we need to do together, this is where you need to focus on getting things done. Now that's a true grassroots-led approach that is being driven by Northerners themselves and coming to the province with credibility. So the reach out was to, first off, Indigenous leadership, which we thought was very important, and then including the municipal leaders, as I spoke about, and then the government regulators and the economic development practitioners. But here's the thing. We ran into a lot of timing issues. So this was a 3-year project in the making. Every spring, we'd have another reason why we needed to push it off to the fall. Every fall, we'd have another reason why we'd have to push it off to the spring. And we got to the point here where we have a new government that's coming into power, and we thought, we have to do this now. That's going to be complicated because we're in the fall, there's a municipal election, and there's a lot of different things that are taking place, but we've got to stop talking and we've got to start acting. Somebody spoke about earlier, you got to get doing stuff. I think it was the CEO for Nipissing, the Nipissing community, but it's very true. At some point, you just have to roll up your sleeves and jump in and start working with what you have and start building. So we decided to do it knowing it was complicated. Then the government freeze came on, so the regulators were locked in their rooms and we couldn't get most of them out, but we had some real good local representation. And then the Assembly of First Nations called an emergency meeting to get all the chiefs out because they had a critical vote they had to do. So we weren't able to tap into all the chief representation we wanted to do, but we had good Aboriginal representation, Indigenous representation in that group. So having said that, it's still really interesting because we had a really good dynamic and cross-section of who we are in Northern Ontario talking about those issues. And what we understood and what we recognized was that the outcomes we're trying to achieve obviously are evolved and evolutionary format, which is key for us to drive, I think, something that's new, get people excited, and then to evolve and move forward, which I think is important. And strengthening the Northern family was the next point that came out of the accord. It became clear to us that our biggest strength is coming together as that family, recognizing that there's a lot of dynamics between us, and we've forever been sort of chasing the crumbs around the cookie as opposed to the cookie itself. And for us to recognize that that diversity in our region and who we are is really our strength. And the sooner we learn how to trust each other and work with each other, and work from the concept of if you were an organization and you had silos, you would eliminate those silos, getting every department to work within the collective at large for what's best for the collective at large. Some departments have to make a sacrifice so other departments can succeed, so the collective at large can succeed and reach its full potential. That became pretty clear to us that the Northern family and strengthening that was key, and I thought it was a real good growth moment inside the summit for those 2.5, 3 days when we talked about those issues, and you can see people bonding and everybody having the very same desire to do the same thing. The other outcome in the accord is a framework for a comprehensive long-term business plan. So it's very key for us, I guess, ultimately to recognize that importance. It's one thing to have a plan or a vision. It's another thing to have a document where you can sit down with people who have to implement it and say, this is where this has to be done, this is what has to be done here, this is the money that's involved, this is where the money is going to come from. That's where our credibility comes. Our credibility comes in when we sit down with folks and we show them that we've not only come up with the vision, but we've also identified where the investments need to be made, where the money is going to come from, and how we minimize the impact on the province. It's important for us to take something to the province that gives them confidence that there's something here that recognizes that there isn't an endless pit of money. And our challenge in Northern Ontario, as we spoke about it, is that we have this large, vast expanse in geography that we really have to recognize is very, very difficult to invest into and to move things forward. Now, we can invest into Northern Ontario, but timing and timelines are going to be challenging because of how much needs to be invested and how much we have to do that. Where if you have a smaller geographic area with with more population density, then that money goes a longer ways. Pardon me. The grassroots-led approach was so important to us to make sure that we recognize this dynamic we spoke about earlier, where we have the large urban centers, we also have the rural centers, and we really need to move that forward and recognize that as being important. So you have the accord sitting in front of you. That's the end result of these 2.5 days. On top of the bonding and I think the movement that we've started where people recognize, and you can see in this group, which a group of probably about the same size as this, relatively speaking, but you can see in the group the desire to want to go down this road. The recognition that it's so important for us to do this, and the frustration about why haven't we done it, and how can we keep getting stuck, and what are these barriers that keep getting in our way. And trust is where this really started to unfold. So when you look at the opening statement inside the accord, you'll see some very critical language around the connection with the Northern family and the Indigenous community, and how important the Indigenous community is to the Northern family. The Indigenous community, we mentioned some language in this accord that's a little bit groundbreaking, I think, in terms of consultation is not enough. That was very clear from the group at large. We need to be able to say things that give people the sense that we hear you, we're moving forward, there's a recognition here. And the comfort level that that brings is something that will go a long ways towards helping us evolve that relationship. The bottom line is, no matter how you look at the dynamics and the political, I guess the political dynamics as well too, that are associated to this whole thing, is if we do not improve the relationship between Northern family and the Indigenous component of the Northern family, we will never reach our full potential developmentally. Then the Indigenous community is a key part of reaching our full potential, economically speaking, in Northern Ontario. So it's very important for us to create functional understandings amongst ourselves, and I think that bonding really started to take place during this discussion. You could see the comfort level building up as well too. Inside the statement of purpose, you'll also see that we're speaking to the whole Northern family at large and how important it is for us to trust each other and to finally start taking this forward. So the statement of purpose is really laid out to identify we've had this summit. It's an important summit, but it's not the only summit. This is not the end game. It's the beginning of a movement. And it's the movement that's very important to us right now, to continue driving this movement forward, to continue to bring communities together, to continue to talk about the issues that are important to us at a grassroots level, and to continue to finitely put together the end result, which is something that's very clearly laid out, functional within the regulatory environment, that the government and the regulators can pick up and put it down on the table and say, we can implement that. And this is how we can functionally implement that. So when you look into the meat and potatoes of the accord, which is the backside of it, once you get past the purpose and the statement, you'll see that there's some key pillars and principles here, 4 of them. First one is the Northern family we talked about and how important that is and how that's something we think transcends right across Northern Ontario. The next one is to move, attract, and retain people. Think about that here for a second. We have all these great ideas about how we're going to reach our full potential and all the great initiatives we should be putting together in Northern Ontario, but we have 6% of the population. And forecasted in 2020 is a 65,000 person loss from attrition and retirement in Northeastern Ontario alone, Northeastern Ontario. So how are we going to put all this stuff together if we don't have the people to go inside the jobs and create and drive that industry? And if you think about, when we're a province, what do we bring to each other in terms of strengths and weaknesses? Well, Southern Ontario's weakness, obviously, is that they're overpopulated, and they don't have as much geography that we do. We're underpopulated, and we have nothing but geography. Where's the plan to start moving people? As immigrants are coming into Southern Ontario, Why are we not moving people from Southern Ontario to Northern Ontario? We have nothing but land. And we have a challenge from a regulatory standpoint where it's expensive to operate that land base because you don't have a big tax base. So start moving people into that land base that creates a tax base and creates money, creates the people who have to work and drive the initiatives, and also creates the people to continue to build the culture in the region itself and make it a healthy, sustainable region somewhere down the road. Very key in our discussions, moving, attracting, and retaining people for the jobs and for driving what we have here in Northern Ontario. There was a really neat discussion around, we look at ourselves, what can we sell to people in Southern Ontario? How can we convince people to come to Northern Ontario? I think all too often we take for granted what we have. So most people in Southern Ontario can sell their home, buy a comparable home in Northern Ontario for a fraction of the price. If you're 40, 50 years old and you've paid off your home and you've got all your equity locked up in your home, here's an opportunity for you at a great time in your life to free up your equity, to put money in your pocket, to move to a part of the province that has clean air, a fresh environment, the forest and the greenness that's all around Northern Ontario, and the exploratory and discovery nature that exists there. Small town, family-orientated lifestyles where people are safe and are not worried about their children and the neighbors are watching their children. And with technology today, it doesn't matter where you live. I'm a management consultant by trade, and I work right across the country, and I live in Cochrane, Ontario, because my work is done through technology, and so most people can do that. We need to start marketing and selling ourselves that way and driving and moving people forward. But to move people, we need infrastructure. We need passenger rail. We need trains. We need whatever the high-tech, forward-thinking transportation modes are going to be. We can't be cutting back as we are right now and going to buses. It doesn't make any functional sense if you're looking long-term in Northern Ontario. Established a modern and forward-thinking infrastructure capacity. So just like people, we're going to build all this great economy. Well, where's the capacity to do it? The Ring of Fire itself, as we mentioned earlier, is sitting there on its own, waiting for somebody to figure out how to make that actually come to fruition because the infrastructure isn't there. Because at the end of the day, the investments weren't made to tie in the western transmission line to the eastern transmission line, and now we're trying to figure out how to do that plus put roads and rail in place. But if we invest in this infrastructure and we get it in place like they've done in Quebec, for example, we now start attracting money from all over the world to want to come here, extract resources so they can make money and move on. Capitalism is a very simple concept. You have 2 cows, you multiply them into 40 cows, you sell them and you retire. But you have to buy those 2 cows. If you don't buy those 2 cows and you take the beans like Jack, you end up just like Jack. Quebec bought the 2 cows. Ontario hasn't bought the 2 cows, and we have to find a way to convince Ontario to buy those 2 cows, invest into that infrastructure, knowing that the money is going to come back. And the only way you're going to do that is with what the final point is, which is the long-term, multi-generational, comprehensive business plan. Not a plan, a business plan. This is where the investments need to go. This is why they need to go there. This is the potential that comes out of that investment. This is when it comes. This is where the money is going to come from. This is the province's role. If we do something like that, I think we stand a really good chance, a much better chance than we have up to now, on convincing successive governments to continue to buy into the plan. Because there's a real rational approach to not only how do we develop the region, but how do we create more revenue for them, and how do we turn ourselves into that economic engine, the frontier that this place really is, that everybody was visualizing 100 years ago. So we think at the end of the day, it's very important for us as a region to recognize that we have to drive this ourselves. We have to really stop waiting for people to come up and do this for us, or we have to stop focusing on explaining to people why we deserve more than we do, because it's easy to explain that. And we really just need to recognize there are so many smart people in this room. There are so many smart people in Northern Ontario. We need to get organized, come together, put this stuff together, go down to the legislature and show the people in the legislature, this is the opportunity you have sitting in Northern Ontario. This is how you turn it into reality. This is our role. This is your role. Can we do this together, and can we move forward and finally start driving this part of the problems? Because when you look at Northern Ontario, if it is not the last frontier in the country, it's one of them. And it's kind of a neat opportunity in 2018 to be sitting someplace where you think about frontierism and the opportunities that are there. But the resources are all through Northern Ontario. Our practices are world-renowned for being environmentally protective and reaching an economy. Our relationships with the Indigenous folks who live here with us as part of our family and the francophone folks are improving. We need to drive that forward, grab the bull by the horns for ourselves, and continue to move. So what we're hoping is, in Cochrane, we were happy to host the first of these summits, but it's just hosting. This is a regional approach. Now we're looking at what are the next 4 or 5 or 6 summits. How do you take these high-level points and start driving into them at each one of these summits? We're hoping institutions like the Northern Policy Institute, who's a huge partner with us in this process, who were bought in right from the beginning and really helped us continue to keep this credible and drive it in the direction it's going to work. We hope institutions like the Northern Policy Institute continue to be a big part of moving this forward and driving our initiatives. But as a movement, we need energy. We need to keep driving it. We really need now for the rest of the communities in the region to look at this and say, this is a great start. I feel good about this. It's the best thing in terms of direction for us that we've had in a long time. How about Community X take this element? How about Community Y take this one? How about we go right to Kenora, right in Mr. Rickford's riding, have him participate in the discussions with us so they can see and feel the drive and energy from the grassroots approach and really start getting traction for ourselves and really start driving the energy behind the movement. It's up to us, folks. We really have to just take charge of our own destiny. I'm really excited about the opportunity we have here as Northerners, and I'm really hoping people share at least a fraction of that excitement with me, and I'm open to questions.
Was there any discussions about linkages between northeastern Ontario, northwestern Quebec, or northwestern Ontario and Manitoba?
I think the primary discussions took place around northern Ontario, and we reached out everywhere, right from northwestern to northeastern. We didn't have a preference on where people came from, as long as they came from northern Ontario. And I explained to you some of the dynamics and challenges we had, but the conversation with the folks we had there was all about we are Northerners, you know, and I think almost everybody, I don't remember any dialogue taking place at all where there was any trepidation around, you know, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be coming together from a regional perspective, recognizing that, you know, we have economies of scale to realize from that, but recognizing that our greatest strength is us as a family moving that forward. I think, honestly, that once we start driving that dynamic, I don't think the concept has any borders. You know, so when you start driving a lot of the initiatives we're talking about, when you look at Canada, about 90% of the population, if I understand it correctly, is about 100 kilometers from the U.S. border, believe it or not. There's still 5,000 kilometers east, 5,000 to the north, 5,000 east and west, where the rest of us live. We are a rural country by nature, so I don't think northern Manitoba and Quebec are much different than northern Ontario. So my answer to you would be I would hope so. I would hope we'd continue to expand amongst ourselves into other parts of the country and continue to grow that strength, because I think we benefit from it as at large, if you will, as a collective.
Thank you, Peter. My name is Paula. I work for the Réseau de soutien à l'immigration francophone de Nord de l'Ontario. So that is the RIF, like a local immigration partnership, but regional one. There are 15 across the country, and there is one for Northern Ontario. My question, there's a lot of things happening in francophone immigration in Ontario at the moment, and I was wondering, were any of these RIFs, was it like, for example, was our organization invited to the conference to tell you activities that are already happening that might be able to be, you know, built on or discussed in further detail as far as, you know, moving those people from Toronto you were talking about into the north?
Yeah.
Or in general, perhaps the francophone community, how were they involved in this summit?
There was a very large francophone representation at the meeting. As you can imagine, our part of the country is very, very francophone oriented. I can't honestly answer you whether RIF was there. I don't recall the actual organizations, but there was a good mix of organizations across the board. In fact, we had a real good, I'd say 2-hour-long discussion on the importance of the francophone community in recognizing them as the Indigenous community as being a pillar in the northern family. So I couldn't tell you specifically who was there. I mean, we could follow up for sure and let you know. But certainly there was a large francophone representation, and it was very clear that the northern family is Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and francophone.
Thank you, Peter. I'm sure it was absolutely, totally convincing, because certainly it was convincing 2 weeks ago. And I applaud the effort. It was certainly a different conversation, I have to say. Lots of people were confused with the whole, how come there's no agenda? And they're still complaining, by the way, just so you know. In any event, I lost my notes somewhere between here and there, so if I miss anybody in the meantime, I apologize. But once again, thank you all for coming to our second annual State of the North. A reminder that the third State of the North is next year in Sault Ste. Marie. I do not know the dates, but You can find them on our website, northernpolicy.ca. It is in September, I think. There's a nod from the back corner, so I'll take that as a given. It'll be matched up with the Northern Ontario Business Awards, so anytime you see a flyer from then, you should start thinking about us as well. I want to thank our sponsors, the presenting sponsor, Northern Ontario Workforce Planning, Moose FM, and that's the only one on the screen, Municipal Finance Association, NOHFC, and someone else, Canador, who of course sponsored the live stream and the charging stations, and of course the folks who generously paid for booths so they could present their information to you, FedNor, Ontario SPCA, and Nordic. Thank you. Last thing I would like to do is highlight the fact that I want to thank the people who are whispering to me at the back of the room. I'm not going to try and name off all the staff, but I will highlight our communications and events team, which is Haley over here in the left-hand side, Jenna, who's our primary events coordinator and responsible for just about everything that's been up to, and of course Christine, who's still engaged in another conversation over there. She never stops talking. That's the danger of hiring a very good outreach officer, by the way. They're never stop doing outreach. So I want to give a special thanks to the three of them and the work they did to make this conference go off as seamlessly as it has. And of course, my thanks to the rest of the team from MPI, all three MPI offices, including the folks from Sault Ste. Marie, who I just mentioned, the team in Sudbury, and the team in Thunder Bay, and of course our intrepid volunteers like Paula, and I don't know if Meg is still in the room or not, but Meg as well. And again, on that note, we'll call it a day. Have a good time. And now I have to rush off and talk to economic development officers, 1DCs. You call them practitioners, right? I'm practicing the language. So thanks again, and thank you. I hope you all enjoyed the opportunity to speak to each other. And as I said, the intention is to take the notes from your conversations, compile them, and as soon as they're ready for release, we'll let you know. Take care.